With the Switch successor looming over the horizon, I thought it would be as good time as any to look back on all the visual novels I played on this platform and rank them just for fun. Hey there, this is Mayrin, and this is totally my voice, and not just some AI I'm using because I'm a lazy bastard. But anyway, let's start. First off, I think I should make clear what I'm including and what not. Surprisingly enough, there's quite the debate regarding what is or isn't a visual novel, with people often categorizing any adventure game as one. No Nintendo Life, Florence, a game without words, can't be a visual novel. So to make things easier, I will just follow a simple rule. If it's on VNDB, I'm counting it as a VN. I will only make one sole exception to that rule, which won't be 13 Sentinels. I do not think that game is a VN, but it's still a banger, so you should play it. Next, this list will only include games I've played and finished, which obviously will mean that the games included here will be dictated by my personal preferences in this genre. In other words, you won't be seeing that many otomegi in here. Nothing against them, but my backlog is already big enough as it is. Similarly, there also won't be that many Western VNs in here. Incidentally, this list will include Japanese-only games. The reasons being, 1, that I can read Japanese just fine. 2, that you never know when these might get an official English release, or if they are already available in English in some form. And 3, that this is my list, so no complaining. But really, I just want to talk about some of these as well, since there are plenty of interesting releases outside of the English sphere. Also, just for the sake of including more stuff, I will also add VNs I played on PC or somewhere else if they also have an English Switch release. And that should cover all the quote-unquote rules. I will go through these alphabetically. Keep in mind that I'm also ranking them within the tiers, so the closer to the left, the higher. You get the idea. Okay, enough of all of this, let's start. And the first visual novel is
5分後に意外な結末、モノクロームの図書館。
What better way to start this list than with a VN that literally no one has heard of? This is basically a collection of really short stories, all of which can be finished in around 5 minutes or so. The whole premise is that you are asked to read all of them and share your thoughts and the emotions that they evoke in you while reading them. This whole thing is what grabbed my attention to give it a shot, and after finishing it, I just felt like it was mostly wasted potential. The stories themselves are fine, although their brevity robbed them of any sort of lasting impact they could have had, since it's nearly impossible to get invested in them. But to me, where this game disappoints is in the weak meta-story aspect, since there is nearly no story outside of these short tales. As a whole, I can't say it was a terrible experience or anything, but it just could have been so much more. C tier.
逆転裁判、エイスアトールネイ。
Next up is the Ace Attorney Trilogy, or the Gakuten Saibon if you want to get fancy. These are extremely popular games, so I feel they have already been talked to death. They certainly are good fun, even if not all of the cases are equal in terms of quality. But the episodic nature, alongside the gameplay focus, helps quite a lot in making these digestible enough for a wider audience. I will admit, though, that I personally don't enjoy the gameplay portions that much. I think at times, they can be slightly annoying with what they want you to do. But I will say, I find it impressive how much they stuck to their guns with this series. They had a working formula and barely changed it, which I can respect. On a side note, I actually played these with my 3Ds, and to be honest, I think they look slightly better than on Switch, since, in my opinion, the sprites look better if they are slightly pixelated, but the Switch port is fine too. Anyway, I would say the first and third games belong in the A tier, while perhaps the second one is a B tier game. Still good, but perhaps not as consistent.
愛、ソムニウムファイル。
The Somnium Files is a tough one to discuss. I actually quite like the Infinity series, so I was curious to see if Uchikoshi still had it, and I thought it simply wasn't as good as those. The mystery itself was decent enough, with an interesting final act, but everything else just felt half-baked. The characters, with the exception of Date and Aiba, were either forgettable, bland, or simply insufferable. The gameplay portions were honestly just bad, relying too heavily on trial and error. And while the murder mystery was fine, I felt like the game left way too many questions unanswered. I know there's a sequel, but that Bollywood dance ending was more than enough to make me steer away from this series.
Yeah.
I personally feel like Air is one of those heavily underappreciated VNs. The most common opinion I've seen is that this one is too esoteric or abstract compared to other Key games, which I simply can't agree with. To me, it's one of Key's most straightforward stories, with an extremely clear main theme that gets developed throughout the different routes. In some ways, it feels like the prototype for what CLANNAD would become, while having a far more approachable length. The second chapter came to me as a huge yet really welcome surprise. I would say it's the type of story that has all the trademarks of a great Key game, while having a far more reasonable length. Plus, it also has the greatest sprite ever made. A tier.
Aiyoku no Eustia.
Moving on to Aiyoku no Eustia. This one is, in my opinion, one of the strongest plot-focused visual novels available on Switch. It's a pretty dark story with fantastic world building and complex characters, all of whom receive interesting and well-developed character arcs. I've seen some complain about the ladder structure, but I personally think it's one of the best implemented ladder structures out there. Mainly because by the end of the story you have this cast of characters with their own beliefs and ideals that had been developed organically throughout the story. The atmosphere is also fantastic and very dynamic, with story arcs taking place in both dark and oppressing streets, as well as more respectable places. It's a story with plenty of range, in-depth character portrayals, and gripping scenes, which is why it's a clear S-tier VN for me.
Akai Aoi Shiro.
Akai and Aoi Shiro are a couple of visual novels that were released a year or so ago. They are often categorized as Yuri ends, but in reality, it's all mostly Yuri bait. In Akai, there's barely any romance at all, to be honest. But regardless, both are quite enjoyable, with solid stories and lots of different endings. Maybe too many, especially in the case of Aoi Shiro. Between the two, I think Akai is the better one, as it manages to strike just the right balance between action, slice of life, and Japanese folklore. Aoi Shiro is also a good time. Its final route is quite strong, but I think it relies a bit too heavily on info dumps, which can get tiresome. That being said, while I can recommend both of these, this release is a bit janky. On a technical level, I encountered a few bugs, such as the skip function skipping text where it shouldn't, despite having it set to only skip already read text, and some visual glitches as well. It's possible some of these might have been fixed with a patch, but I haven't checked. On the other hand, the translation, from what I've heard and seen myself, is spotty, to say the least. I played them in Japanese, and while doing so, I kept thinking that neither of these are exactly easy to translate. It's a shame since the writing of the original text is really good. Personally, I would place Akai in the A tier, while Aoi Shiro in the B tier. But once again, keep in mind that this is for its Japanese versions. If you are playing in English, maybe knock them down a tier.
Anonymous Code.
Next up is Anonymous Code, a fairly hyped-up release in the Western market, with it being the latest main entry in the popular science adventure series. I played it back when it came out in Japan, and my thoughts remain the same. It's a fun story with plenty of action set pieces, but in some areas it feels a bit underdeveloped, mainly the characters. Out of all the science adventure games I've played, this one probably has the weakest cast I've seen, with barely any character development at all. So, while the story itself is really fast-paced, the sacrifice for that was removing any sort of slice-of-life scenes from the story, making the relationships between the characters feel empty. I also found the game systems to be a bit obtuse at times, especially regarding the true ending. But still, it's far from a bad game, and if you can look past the shallowness, it's a decently engaging story. A solid B-tier visual novel. Next up is Aokana, one of the few big-name Galga that received an English release with a retail physical edition. I can safely say it lives up to its reputation, with an extremely charming cast of characters as well as a surprisingly engaging fictional sport called flying circus. The combination of action scenes, comedy, and romance makes this title truly enjoyable. The presentation is also excellent, with a soft and warm vibe to it. Its only main issue, perhaps, being that some of the most likable characters ended up without roots. Although you could say that's a testament to the quality of the cast, but besides that, this is a solid recommendation from me. Easy A tier.
Aonatsu Line.
Aonatsu Line was for me one of the biggest surprises I had with a VN. I went in expecting little more than a generic but well-presented galgui. But what I got instead was one of the best childhood friend routes I've seen. It's a story that establishes that sort of relationship deadlock that's common in this type of route, but it does so in a believable way with a really satisfying conclusion. Truth be told, the other two routes are kind of generic, but to me, it's worth it just for that one particular route. The presentation is also really solid. It kind of feels like playing an anime movie. And needless to say, the art style is extremely pleasant. This is a solid A-tier recommendation.
Apathy. Narugami Gakuen Nana Fushigi.
I know I said I would only include visual novels that I had finished, but this will be a slight exception, although not entirely. Technically speaking, I have finished it, at least the main story. Basically, this is a collection of short stories, ranging from horror to mystery to supernatural stuff, but there's a main narrative happening in the background. So, while I did finish that main narrative, I still have to get all the endings, which I don't know if I will ever be able to do, since there are more than 500 of them. This is one of the few rare cases in visual novels where it feels like you are changing the stories with your choices, rather than choosing which route you want to get it, if that makes any sense. Certainly, variety and the element of surprise are the strongest points of this title. You never know what you are going to get with each story or how is it going to play out. Of course, some of those stories are great, some not so much, but that's also part of the charm. The main issue this game has is the lack of a flowchart to help you keep track of what you've finished and what you still have to read. It feels like a big oversight and would have easily pushed this into the higher echelon of visual novels on Switch. As it stands, it's still pretty good.
Arcade Spirits. Sa, kusoge.
Oh boy, Arcade Spirits. This one I definitely did not enjoy. The story was uninteresting, the characters and the humor fell flat, and the presentation was just off. But the worst thing about it has to be the protagonist. As it has to be, without exaggeration, the worst protagonist I've ever seen in a visual novel. It tries to be a self-insert type of character, but it doesn't work for multiple reasons. First, unlike what this game thinks, a self-insert protagonist is not a protagonist with a husk of a personality, but rather a protagonist with a predictable personality that takes decisions similarly to what the player would if they were in their position. In this game, though, the game tries to give you multiple options occasionally, with the choices being complete opposites, so you end up with a protagonist that feels like it has some multiple personality disorder. Then, from time to time, they just drop some preachy life lessons that makes it feel like the writer is forcefully inserting their opinions onto you. And to make matters worse, every other character just treats the MC as some sort of perfect, amazing human being. So it just feels like the writer is using this character to stroke their own ego. I know I'm not the target audience for this sort of game, but still, I feel like it just gets pretty much everything that makes this genre interesting wrong. And it also ended on a cliffhanger, which is a trend I absolutely do not want to see in this medium, which is why it goes into the F tier.
Archetype Arcadia.
Archetype Arcadia is a VN I want to like more than I do. It's filled with ambitious ideas, having a fully fleshed out and unique setting, as well as plenty of interesting themes being handled. Even if the whole thing about humans needing to always be connected to a virtual world to survive is perhaps not the subtlest of messages. It's just that, quite often, it felt like the story dragged on for way longer than needed. It also tries to give a tragic backstory to pretty much every single character in the story, which I respect. But with such a large cast, this was perhaps too much unnecessary drama. So overall, while I do respect what it was trying to achieve, I don't know if I can give it a glowing recommendation. This one goes to the C tier.
バディミッションボンド。
Next up, Buddy Mission Bond, a Japan-exclusive game published by none other than Nintendo, and it shows because the production values of this one are truly something else. This espionage visual novel might be one of the most visually stunning BNs I've played, rivaling the likes of Tsukihime or Mihoyo. I'm honestly kind of surprised they never bothered to localize it. The game itself is fairly solid, even if the story can be a little bit predictable at times. But the chemistry between the characters does make up for it. The game does occasionally give off BL vibes, which is maybe why they didn't think it would be a good fit for Western audiences. No idea. There's also a surprising amount of side content, perhaps around 10 or so extra hours of completely optional short stories, which is kinda nuts. However, the actual gameplay in between the visual novel portions is not that great, with puzzles that seem to be designed for toddlers. But still, solid game overall. B tier.
カオスヘッドのカオスチャイルド。
Moving on to a couple of relatively popular titles, with Chaos Head Noah and Chaos Child. Out of the two, Chaos Head is a fairly divisive visual novel, mainly due to its protagonist. He's unique, and you will either love him or hate him, and in my case, I think he's great. While not uncommon, anti-hero protagonists can be a tricky matter to pull off. In my opinion, it comes down to how the story treats them, as in if they receive the punishment, for lack of a better word, that they deserve. And in the case of Chaos Head Noah, I think they nailed that. What I really like about this VN is how it's like an inverted murder mystery, where in your usual murder mystery story, it's the protagonist who's trying to follow all the clues and find the truth. In this game, it's the murders who follow the protagonist, creating an oppressive atmosphere that makes the plot that much more engaging. Personally, I would rank Chaos Head Noah as the best title in the science adventure series, but Chaos Child is also a solid entry. In some ways, it feels like this sequel is going over the same ground, having a similar premise as well as a loser protagonist, but it has a handful of truly memorable moments of its own to make it worth the read. So to me, Chaos Head Noah goes into the S tier, while Chaos Child goes into the A tier.
クラナド。
Before talking about CLANNAD, I have to admit that it is basically my favorite visual novel of all time. So my opinion on it might be a little bit biased here. Just a little bit. But even then, I feel like it's an absolute must-play for any visual novel aficionado. The sheer emotional punch some roots have, especially the afterstory, is really something else. I also find it rare, even after having finished so many VNs, to see a story that so thoroughly presents its world and all of its characters, some of whom you might not even meet during your first playthrough. Admittedly, it's extremely long, and reaching the true ending is an endeavor in and of itself, but the payoff is more than worth it. It goes into the S tier.
クラナド、光見守る坂道で。
As for CLANNAD side stories, this is closer to a collection of drama CDs than an actual VN, to be honest. There are some okayish stories in here, but it's by no means a must-read or anything. If you are just starving for more CLANNAD, it's a decent time. Otherwise, feel free to skip it. C tier.
コーヒートーク。
Coffee Talk is basically an imitation of another title that I will also talk about later on. But to me, this one lacks what made that one stand out. There's not a single character in this game that I found remotely charming. And I know this comes down to personal preference, but everything about them just gave me this impression that they were trying so hard to be like the cool kids in town. The same goes for their stories. The main themes dealt here are plain obvious and simply boring, to the point where I barely cared at all. The game does admittedly have a chill atmosphere, but you can't use that to cover what's essentially a shallow experience. Honestly, just play Valhalla instead.
弾丸論破。
The Danganronpa Trilogy, just like Ace Attorney, is yet another extremely popular collection of games. These are also murder mystery games, with lots of personality and style. Like the Ace Attorney games, not every case is as engaging, but when it gets good, it gets really good. The first one does, at times, feel like it was more like a proof of concept, but it's still enjoyable. The second one is no doubt the best of the series, with some truly brilliant moments. And the third one, while it has a divisive ending, I still think it was quite good, though maybe not on the same level as the second, but it still held its own, which is why I would rank these as B tier, A tier, and B tier respectively.
シーンデスマーク
Deathmark is a game with a strong horror atmosphere and an utterly forgettable story. I think it completely wastes its characters, since each time you move on to the next chapter, the cast gets completely swapped with a new one. While I like how each chapter is some sort of contained short story, and some of those were entertaining, the overall plot simply lacks the consistency to make it memorable. I also found the gameplay portions to be terrible. But as far as horror-themed stories, it does more or less hit that spot. C tier.
デザイア背徳の螺旋
Desire is an interesting one. It was written by the same writer as You Know and Eve Burst Error, and it really shows sharing elements from both titles. For example, just like Eve, the game is played from two different perspectives, which honestly is something I wish more VNs did, as it gives more depth to certain plot events. This remake also adds a few quality-of-life improvements that are a godsend considering how obtuse these older adventure games can be at times. That being said, after playing it on Switch, I don't know if I would recommend it on this platform. The reason being that it has infidelity as one of its main themes, and it doesn't work as well with the explicit content being removed. But anyway, this one goes into the B tier.
イブバーストエラー
Eve Burst Error is another pretty old game. Just like Desire, despite its age, I believe it still holds remarkably well, at least story-wise. Also, like Desire, this game is told from the perspective of two characters, but unlike that one, you can swap between the two at any time. Well, more or less, it's actually like playing two separate playthroughs at once, although there's one truly brilliant moment in the story where the two perspectives finally intersect. This game has received quite a few remakes, but I would say this is probably the best one, since not only does it incorporate some much-needed quality-of-life improvements, but it also retains the original artwork almost intact. Probably my favorite thing about this VN are the characters, and how the relationships between them are dealt with a surprising degree of maturity, which nowadays feels refreshing considering the usual age of your average visual novel character. Overall, if you can deal with some old-school game design, this one is definitely worth checking out. B tier.
ファミコン探偵クラブ消えた後継者ファミコン探偵クラブパート2後ろに立つ少女
Next up are the Famicom Tantei Club remakes. To be honest, I don't know if anyone even remembers that Nintendo published these. They were given so little fanfare despite clearly being developed with a lot of love for the source material. Personally, I feel like the stories still hold up fairly well, in particular the second one, whose final revelation was brilliant. As far as quality of life improvements, they could have certainly added a few more, but I respect how faithful they are to the originals while also looking incredibly good. Overall, I had a great time with these two, but I can only recommend them to people who don't mind old-school designed adventure games, not only for the general systems, but also for the way the story is presented and conducted. Still, really good games. B and A tiers, respectively.
フェイトステイナイト
Well, this is one of the hard things about making this sort of list. Yes, I played Fate Stay Night, but I did so many years ago that I'm not sure if I were to play it now for the first time, I would still have the same opinion. As for my impression of that time, I remember not caring that much about the Fate route, but Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel were really good. Probably my favorite thing about it was how different every route felt and played out. It was interesting how relatively mundane choices could have that sort of butterfly effect on the whole story. Plus, the combination of high-stakes action scenes with more relaxed slice-of-life moments created a fantastic sense of pacing throughout the whole experience. I'm slightly hesitant to rate this extremely high since, as I said, the Fate route didn't click with me that much, but everything else was damn fun.
フォルトマイルストン1&2
Default Milestone games are mostly forgettable fantasy-themed VNs. The issue I had with them is that they spent way too much time with world building and trying to explain the lore rather than telling a deep story. It's clear that both of them are nothing more than chapters from a bigger saga, but I'm simply not a fan of this type of storytelling within this medium. I would rather have something that feels complete on its own. The actual stories aren't that bad, but nothing remarkable either, which is why I rate both of them more or less similarly at the C tier.
食用系少女2美食内戦
Food Girls 2 is a low-budget VN/management sim that doesn't particularly excel in either aspect. The story barely makes sense, the characters are bland, and overall, there's really nothing truly worth praising. You can probably get some enjoyment out of the shallow management sim portion, but as a VN, I can't say I recommend it. Maybe I should have played the first game instead, but I can't say I care that much. D tier.
グリザヤの果実
There have been quite a few Grisaia VNs released on Switch. In fact, this one is sold as a trilogy of the first 3, but personally, I've only played the first one. The reason being that, after finishing it, I was done with the series. It's not like I think it's a bad game or anything. I would even say it's pretty good, but it's one of those visual novels where I don't think it really needed that many sequels, or even one, to be honest. As for the game itself, my main complaint was that, to me, the common route took a painfully long time to finish. But the individual routes were quite good, at least most of them, and had satisfying conclusions. I think Sachi and Michiru's routes were the best ones, but the rest were decent as well. I would say the strongest aspect of this VN is the character depth. It's one of those narratives that's really good at subverting the reader's expectations, especially for those who are quite used to the usual anime tropes. If it had better pacing, I would probably have rated it slightly higher. But for me, it is a B-tier VN.
義賊探偵の3
Gizoku Tante Nosuri is a decent addition to the Utawareru Mono series, although I find it odd that the actual games never made their way to the Switch. But Aqua Plus is kind of weird like that. As for this spin-off, it's fine. It more or less plays like Ace Attorney, where you have to investigate different scenes, but it's all really lighthearted, with comedy taking the main spotlight over the actual mystery. Again, for what it is, it's quite fun, but it has a price issue that I can't really ignore. This costs like 4k yen, yet it only takes less than 6 hours to finish both the main story and all the side content. Regardless, if you are a big Utawareru Mono fan, I can recommend it. Otherwise, maybe not. C tier.
グノーシア
You know when I said I would be making one exception regarding games that aren't on VNDB? This is it. Gnosia is one of my favorite titles in general available on Switch. Not just visual novels, so I'm aware my opinion here might be slightly biased. I found it to be a really interesting take on the werewolf mafia game, while also providing a complex and well-told story. It is, however, important to know what you are getting into. This game is 2/3 gameplay and 1/3 visual novel, and if you aren't into the type of gameplay it provides, you will probably find the game way too repetitive. I personally found it to be so tightly designed that once I got used to its systems, I was just flying through loops so fast that repetition never became an issue. As for the characters, I found them all to be quite unique, and the interactions between them were always entertaining. What I enjoyed the most about Gnosia was seeing how their personalities were actually reflected in their behavior during the trials, and finding those subtle hints when something was off was truly rewarding. So, for me personally, I believe it deserves to be in the S tier, but I'm aware this isn't a game for everyone.
大逆転裁判ザグレイとアイスアトルニー
Next up is The Great Ace Attorney, a duology of 2 really good adventure games. Unlike the first trilogy, this one goes for a more cohesive narrative, and for the most part, it delivers what I believe is a better story. I do have one issue with this approach, which is that, as a result, the first game had an extremely slow start. The first 2 cases feel at best like complete filler, and at worst like an overly extended tutorial. But once things pick up, it's a great ride. One quality of life improvement this release has that I deeply appreciate is the possibility to straight up skip all gameplay and play the game as if it were some sort of kinetic novel. I know some will disagree with me here, but to me, the gameplay has always been the weakest part of the Ace Attorney series, so this was a huge plus for me. As far as ranking it, I would say the first one belongs in the B tier, while the second one belongs in the A tier. Hakuchumu no Aojashin is a Japanese exclusive VN, at least on Switch, but you can play this one in English on PC, and I'm pretty sure there's a patch for the Switch version if you have homebrew running on your console. In many ways, it reminded me of Fata Morgana, which I will get to briefly, especially in the way the story is presented. It starts with 3 seemingly unrelated stories, but then proceeds to connect all of them in a brilliant fashion. I did feel, however, that during this final chapter, it spent a bit too much time with its lore and info dumps, and that some actions taken by the MC were a bit idiotic. But nevertheless, this was a really good visual novel with an ambitious narrative that I can strongly recommend. A tier. Harmonia is a short, kinetic visual novel by Key that's decent enough for what it is, but also one that doesn't really try anything particularly ambitious. While it had some interesting ideas, when playing it, I was getting a constant feeling of déjà vu. In fact, if you have read other short BNs by Key, you will probably be able to guess how this story will exactly unfold. Again, it's not bad, but it's also hard to recommend, especially considering that there are already plenty of better similar options from the same developer, such as Planetarian, Lunaria, or Tsui no Stella, which I'm willing to bet won't take that long to be released in English on Switch, so try this one only if you are a hardcore Key fan and need to read literally everything they have produced. I've often seen people be disappointed that Higurashi on Switch doesn't have English, at least officially. But let me tell you, this release is one of the worst ways to play this VN. The problem is that it basically forces you to read side content, mostly console arcs, in between the main chapters. And I don't care what others say. That side content is truly, truly awful. It's probably some of the dullest visual novel content I've ever read, with constant pointless meandering and unnecessary filler. Apparently, they released a DLC that lets you skip those, but you need to pay for that. As for the main chapters, they are quite good. I really like the slow and gradual change from everyday life to supernatural horror. There are some scenes where the buildup of tension is fantastic. I will admit, though, that I'm not as big of a fan of them as probably most people. I still kind of prefer Umineko over it, but there's no denying that Higurashi provides some memorable and simply iconic moments. Probably my favorite chapters were the 5th and 6th. To me, those really stood out in terms of quality. Overall, I would rate the first 4 chapters slightly lower than the others, but still good nonetheless. B and A tier. The house in Fata Morgana is probably one of the highest rated VNs of all time. I think it got a lot of attention after the whole Metacritic debacle, where for some time it was the highest rated game on Switch. It even had a 100 score for a day or two. Does it deserve that reputation? Kind of. If I'm being honest, I played it a long time ago when I had only played maybe 10 or so VNs, so my experience with the medium was rather limited. Looking back, I don't know if I would still rate it as some sort of flawless masterpiece. There's no denying that the first hours are really slow, but even so, I still believe it is an incredibly strong narrative, and probably a title all visual novel fans should at least play. It has that sort of ambitious narrative that very few have, and the way the story slowly comes together is just stunning. One thing to keep in mind is that the game does not have any voice acting, at least the main game, which for some might be a bit of a shame. But I didn't mind that much because the music more than made up for it. So yeah, even after all these years, I think I still rate Fatamoru as one of the Switch's strongest visual novels available. Definitely check it out. The release of House in Fata Morgana includes a bunch of fan discs and side stories. Out of those, I've only played Requiem for Innocine, which was decent enough. I see that on VNDB it has a crazy high score, which, to be honest, I don't really understand why. Don't get me wrong, it's fine for what it is, but it just felt to me like an unnecessary addition. The story of this one was already covered in the main game, admittedly on a smaller scale, but I don't think it needed to be expanded. And some of the new characters it introduced weren't that interesting. There's one event in particular, which more or less was the main cause of the main conflict, that I thought was pretty dumb. But regardless, it's fine, especially if you love the original and just can't get enough, but it's far from a must-play. B tier.
この大空に翼を広げて If my heart had wings.
If my heart had wings, or Kono Uzora ni Tsubasa wo hirigete. If you want to say its actual name, I've always found it weird when Western releases of VNs completely change the title from its original. But anyway, this one is fine. Nothing incredible, but it has some decent roots, mostly Kotori's root and maybe Amane's too. But the rest are whatever. I personally found all the scenes focusing on the aviator stuff to be quite boring, but the character development during the better routes was strong enough. Something important to note is that one of the routes, Agehas, was strongly censored in its translation, mainly because the original simply wouldn't work without the adult content, so keep in mind that if you are going to read that route, you will be reading mostly fan fiction. But otherwise, it's fine. There aren't that many moegs available on Switch, which kind of gives this one a bit of an edge, but it's far from an essential title. B tier.
Island.
Island is one of those VNs that I respect, but I don't like it that much, if that makes any sense. There's a lot of ambition in here, with an unexpected and honestly sort of brilliant main twist. It's just that it doesn't work as well as it could have. Basically, the game starts as your average galg, with 3 routes for each of the main girls that you need to finish in order to progress the story. The purpose of those routes is clearly to get you invested in these characters, to make the following events hit that much harder. But I just found the routes to be kind of weak and bland. The ending is another slightly controversial part. Some think it's genius, some think it's terrible. While I didn't hate it, it's true that it's not that satisfying. But still, I appreciated what the game was going for as a whole. And even if it didn't quite hit the mark, there's enough entertainment here to be enjoyed. A decent B-tier visual novel.
Iwakura Aria.
Iwakura Aria is the last visual novel I've finished on Switch so far. It's a game developed by mages, mostly known for their science adventure games. But this time, they made a completely original story. And to be honest, they actually delivered something that's quite good. It's a story that focuses on the relationship between 2 girls, while also including an engaging mystery plot. The story is set in Japan in 1966, all taking place inside a Western-style manor, which is one of my favorite types of settings. The strongest points of this visual novel are its atmosphere and character development. Perhaps it's not an absolute must-read, but what it lacks in impact more than makes it up with subtle and thoughtful storytelling. It's a solid A-tier VN for me.
Canon.
Canon is an old yet extremely charming visual novel, and after 25 years, it finally got its official English release. This was the first VN developed by Key, which not only established the blueprint they would base their future games on, but also influenced a huge wave of galg, establishing the Nakig genre as one of the main style tendencies of this medium. Despite its age, though, Canon has plenty of aspects that still hold up remarkably well, such as its winter atmosphere and the interactions between the members of the cast. There are some areas where the age does show, such as some roots, in particular Mai's, being a bit of a mess, but the soul this game exudes is more than enough to look past its rough points. Even if it's not a perfect visual novel, Canon is certainly worth checking out for any galg fan out there.
Little Busters.
Little Busters is one of the Switch's biggest visual novels, and I mean that both figuratively and literally. If you want to finish all of its content, it might take you more than 80 hours. When talking about the longest VNs by Key, it's usually CLANNAD that gets all the attention, but Little Busters is absolutely massive. Thankfully, it's also quite good. In many ways, it's quite similar to CLANNAD, but unlike CLANNAD, Little Busters focuses on the relationship between a group of friends, and I think it does a really good job at fleshing out their dynamics. I do think the individual routes aren't as consistent, but the true route is fantastic and greatly recontextualizes all the events that were happening before. This was also their first title where Key decided to include mini-games, which would become something of a tradition for them, with the main one here being a stupidly fun baseball minigame. This version also includes some extra routes that were added in later releases, and I honestly believe they are stronger than most of the base game character routes. Overall, just a great VN all around, one that I strongly recommend, even if it might take you months to finish. Looper, however, while good, I can see why most Key fans were left disappointed by it. I mean, it's fine. It has some strong points to it, like its pacing and Mia as a character. But at the same time, it took so many questionable decisions. It was written by Ryukishio 7, famous for games like Higurashi or Umineko, which was one of the main factors in the game's hype. As a result, people were expecting something closer to those. And what we got instead was a decent, if slightly unremarkable, Key story. To me, its biggest issues were how it mostly ignored the time loop stuff in exchange for geo-tracking or whatever it was called. I can see the appeal of making a story focused on treasure hunting to strengthen the bond between a group of characters, but most of the side characters were so shallow and barely developed that I don't think it worked that well. I have to say, though, that I think the art style looks amazing. It has a lot of personality and flair, to the point where I would say it's its biggest selling point. Recently, they announced they would be making a Plus version that should be released relatively soon, but I honestly don't know if there's enough potential in this premise and cast to massively improve it. But as for this one, it's not terrible, just an okay-ish VN. Lover Kiss is a dating sim I picked up mainly because it looked similar to Amagami, which it was since it's some sort of spiritual sequel to it. But at the same time, it also wasn't as engaging as that one. Some routes were decent enough to be enjoyed on their own, and I must admit I found the whole photographing part to be oddly amusing. But as a whole, it was just decent. I think I'm slightly more positive about it than I would usually be, mostly because actual dating sims are super rare nowadays, and this kind of scratches that itch. That being said, the Switch version runs pretty badly, with the frame rate dancing around the 20s, but from what I've heard, the PS4 is slightly censored, so there's no winning side here. Lunaria is one of the latest kinetic visual novels developed by Key. Similar to stuff like Planetarian or Tsui no Stella, it's centered around a girl, all taking place in a futuristic setting. The main gist of this one is that the protagonist is some sort of famous esports athlete competing in a VR racing game. I must admit that I found these racing parts to be quite repetitive and not as exciting as the game thought they were. On the other hand, Lunar Q was extremely likable and cute. To be honest, she basically carried the plot for me. As a whole, Lunaria follows the Key formula to a T, and as a result, it's not the most original thing they have produced, but the strength of Lunar Q is more than enough to turn this game into a decent one. It's a B tier.
Magatsu Barai.
Next up is Magatsu Barai, which is Light's latest visual novel. When it was announced, I remember people being surprised, since Light had previously said that they would stop making new games, so I just felt obliged to support them in some manner. And while before it I hadn't played any other titles from them, I ended up really enjoying it. Although, to be honest, first impressions weren't that good, this visual novel feels very bombastic and is always on your face, both in its writing, its visuals, and its background music. But once you get used to it, there's a well-put-together action plot in there, with plenty of slice-of-life scenes to spice things up. Tsubasa and Shion, in particular, had really good roots. Since its release, Magatsu Barai did receive an 18+ version on PC, which honestly, I kind of expected, since while playing it there were some very obvious cuts when things were getting steamy, but it's one of those situations where the adult content is just fan service stuff and is not that relevant to the plot. Another thing that does put this version behind the PC release is that, surprisingly enough for a VN, it doesn't run that well on Switch. It kind of chugs when opening the backlog or when using the skip function, which isn't like a deal breaker but does get a bit annoying. Regardless, this is, in my opinion, a strong action visual novel that I can easily recommend.
魔法使いの夜
Mihoyo is no doubt one of the biggest and most important visual novel releases the Switch has received so far. It was surprising to see Type Moon actually making an official translation of one of their VNs, and while the translation itself is slightly inaccurate at times, that doesn't detract from the quality of this title. The first thing that immediately becomes apparent when booting up are the absurd production values. There are plenty of little details in its presentation which greatly help in setting the tone and atmosphere, as well as making the fight scenes that much more exciting. It's also a really well-paced story with barely any filler, but at the same time, it also includes a few optional side chapters to further elaborate its narrative and characters. And speaking of which, I think the chemistry between the main three characters is fantastic. If I were to point out a negative, I feel like it perhaps lacks one or maybe two truly memorable scenes, like Tsukihime or Fate Stay Night do. But regardless, it's still a simply fantastic experience through and through. A tier.
メモリーズオフ
And now it's time for the Memories Off extravaganza. Basically, Mages released a collection called Memories Off Historia, which contains most mainline titles from the series. It's a fairly interesting franchise, one that went through multiple developers and subgenres. I think it's often unappreciated, possibly due to it remaining untranslated, so I will briefly talk about each one. Starting with the first one, personally, I find it to be a really charming old-school nakige, although perhaps not that unique in some respects. You could probably make a considerable list of similarities between it and canon, but there's something about it that I just really enjoy. I think it's probably that I have a weakness for VNs of this era. By the way, this was the first VN Uchikoshi worked on, which I find kind of amusing.
メモリーズオフピュア
Next up is Memories Off Pure, the fan disc of the original. And I get the feeling Mages doesn't even know it was included in the collection, mainly because nowhere on their marketing material they used to promote the Memories Off Historia release did they mention that it was going to include this title too. In a way, it's impressive, really. Just imagine any other publisher just forgetting to mention that whatever compilation they are releasing actually includes another game. Anyway, the game itself is okay, mostly what you would expect from a fan disc. It's like a prequel of sorts, but it also includes a what-if scenario. As some extra content in the collection, I think it's great, but on its own, it's nothing special. C tier.
メモリーズオフセカンド
Memories Off Second is, to me, the point in the series when it finally found its footing and its own unique style to differentiate it from other nakigwe of the time. What I like the most about it is how it presents one main narrative theme and explores it from different perspectives during each route. I'm also a big fan of its atmosphere. There's something oddly nostalgic and melancholic about it. Probably its main drawback is that there are a couple of routes that the story could have done without, but otherwise, I think it's excellent. A tier.
思い出に変わる君メモリーズオフ
The next entry, Omoide ni Kawaru Kimi Memories Off, however, is a bit of an odd one. If Memories Off Second finally found a solid formula to develop, Omoide ni Kawaru took it and yanked it out of the window. In some ways, it is like the opposite of Second. Instead of focusing on just one theme, they went and tried to cover as many as possible, and it comes across like the game doesn't know what it wants to say. The interactions between the characters are also kind of weird, almost uncanny, like something Tomi Wiseau would write. The game also puts an odd emphasis on its male cast, which I wouldn't mind too much, except that most of them are unlikable. I probably wouldn't go as far as to say it's terrible, since it's clear that they at least tried to do something unique, for example, having the game take place at a university, but it's also one of the series' weakest entries in my opinion. C tier.
メモリーズオフそれから
The next installment, Sorikara, fares a lot better. It feels in plenty of ways like a direct sequel to Second, having a similar premise and the same setting, and for the most part, it succeeds at being a worthy follow-up. It also has one of my favorite routes in the entire series. That one is Miyabi's route. I thought the evolution of their relationship felt really natural, and their storyline was quite satisfying. At the same time, this game also has one of my least favorite routes, Haya's route. I honestly don't know why they thought a character that encompassed all of the late 2000s cringe would be a good candidate for a route. To be honest, she is the reason why I rate Sorekara lower than second. One unfortunate aspect of this game is that, similarly to Omoide no Kawaru Kimi, in order to reach the true route, you need to clear every individual route, which I found to be unnecessary. As a whole, I still think it's one of the strongest entries in the series, even with the occasional hiccup. Now, on to the second volume of Memories Off Historia, starting with Memories Off 5, Togareta Film. I more or less have similar feelings towards it to Sorekara. It shares the same type of structure, but I think the true route was handled better here in Togareta Film. The foreshadowing for the main conflict had a level of subtlety that you don't see that often. I also found the premise of the main protagonist needing to get over the passing of his closest friend to be an interesting idea. The individual routes, however, were a mixed bag. I would say half of them are quite interesting and enjoyable, but the other half are either underdeveloped or kind of frustrating. Still, I think it's quite good overall. B tier.
Memories of T-Wave.
Memories Off T-Wave was the first game not developed by the original developer, but instead by mages, and it shows. In this entry, they toned down the mystery aspect previous entries had, possibly because I'm guessing they didn't want it to overlap with their science adventure games, and focused instead on the romance. But I don't think they particularly nailed that aspect either. To be honest, there's only one route in here that I would say I enjoyed. The rest were either mediocre or straight up bad. In particular, I found the main heroine to be extremely annoying and unlikable. On its own, one could say it's a competently made visual novel, but as a Memories Off entry, it falls way behind. D tier.
Memories of Yubikiri no Kyoku.
Funnily enough, Yubikiri no Kyoku, the next entry and last game featured in this collection, went in the exact opposite direction and focused way more on the mystery. And, as a result, I think this one is yet another really solid entry. I will admit, some character routes could have been better. There's one in particular about an exchange student who is supposedly American, but her English was so bad that it made some supposedly serious scenes way too funny. That being said, I believe the true route to be one of the strongest main routes in the whole series. B tier.
Memories of Innocent Fille.
Since we are on the topic of Memories Off, I might as well include the 8th installment, Innocent Fille, even if I played this one on PC. Out of all the Mem-Off games, this is to me the one that best bridges the mystery and drama this series is known for. It might start with a couple of slightly unmemorable routes, but everything else after that was really entertaining. But what I enjoyed the most was the side route dedicated to Shin, the side character that has appeared in every single. Seeing his story concluded was deeply satisfying and was a great send-off to the series, since this entry was supposed to be the last, until mages changed their minds and decided to keep it alive. Not that I'm fully complaining. Anyway, great entry nonetheless. A tier.
Memories of Innocent Fille. For Dearest.
For Dearest is Innocent Fille's fan disc, and it sure is a fan disc. There's really not that much to say about it. It's just a collection of after stories for each of the main heroines. There's one in there, whose name I can't say due to spoilers, that I thought was interesting enough since it brought that sort of tension the main game really excelled at, but other than that, it was nothing special. B tier.
Miracle Sweet Shop.
Now that we are done with the Mem-Off series, let's move on to something different. Miracle Snack Shop. This is a Korean-developed visual novel/management sim, similar to Food Girls, but I think this one is the stronger one out of the two, but not by much, if I'm being honest. You get to choose between two girls, and while the main one, as in the one that's on the cover, has a decent, if generic plot, the other one has to be one of the most annoying characters I've seen. Her route is basically you simping for her for no good reason. Admittedly, both routes do have some basic character development, which is what saves this one, and the management sim aspect, while nothing special, can be entertaining. It's nothing I would strongly recommend, but you could probably do worse than this.
Muv-Luv.
Well, it sure took a while, but the Muv-Luv games are finally available on Switch. The main series consists of a trilogy of games, the first two, Extra and Unlimited, being bundled together. Muv-Luv Extra can be a bit generic, especially nowadays, but there's enough comedy to make it enjoyable. Probably the main part that nearly everyone hates is a certain story arc revolving around the sport of lacrosse. That part has been memed to death due to its unnecessary length. But other than that, it's really not that bad. Unlimited is when things begin to pick up narratively, although it suffers from being the middle chapter in a trilogy, as in it's mostly there to set things up for the final installment. Regardless, these two are a must-play, not because they are incredible VNs, but because without them, you won't be able to truly enjoy Muv-Luv Alternative, one of the greatest visual novels ever made.
Muv-Luv Alternative.
And speaking of which, Muv-Luv Alternative, I would say, more than easily lives up to its reputation. Sure, there are some chapters where things slow down, relying a bit too heavily on info dumps, but the highs of this visual novel are something else. Something I love about this game is how it explores so many themes, from political to personal values, despite a massive war for humanity's survival taking place. But the best thing about Alternative is one particular scene, of which I'm sure most people who've read it know which one I'm talking about, and how the chapter that follows it completely recontextualizes the whole trilogy. It's one of the most genius plot twists I've ever seen, let alone in this medium. Easily an S-tier visual novel.
Paranormacite File 23 本所七不思議.
Paranormacite is an interesting take on the traditional adventure-style game. It plays like a point-and-click game, but with the sensibilities of something like Ace Attorney or any other Japanese adventure game. The story itself is a mix between horror and murder mystery, but it has a unique spin to it that honestly kind of reminded me of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Personally, I found the first part of the story to be the most interesting, and in some ways, I wished it kept that tone throughout the whole experience, but the rest of the game isn't bad either. I would say it's a B-tier visual novel, but I can see plenty of potential in this series if they ever make a follow-up game for it.
Parfait Chocolat Second Brew.
Parfait Chocolate Second Brew was a VN that was in my radar for a while, mainly for two reasons. One, it's rated extremely high over at EGS, and two, it was written by Maruto Fumiaki, who would later on write White Album 2, one of the best VNs of all time. But as for Parfait, I think it has some strong scenes and good ideas, but as a whole, it's just okay. What I enjoyed the most about them were probably the confession scenes. They were both sweet and kind of awkward, but in a realistic and charming way, which also applies to how the relationships between the characters progressed in the story. The game got its high reputation mostly thanks to Rikako's route, and while I can see why, I think it could also have gone a little bit deeper towards the end. It feels to me like after dropping such a revelation, the story needed a bit more time to let it sink and make its consequences more relevant, but instead it just ended shortly after. Also, it felt like the other routes often recycled similar narrative tricks to close things up. But I do still think that as a whole, it was a good time, just probably not an absolute masterpiece. B tier.
Planetarian 小さな星の夢.
I think most people had forgotten that Planetarian was even released on Switch, but then the recent physical release put it slightly on the map once again, even if it was too little too late. Despite this, I would still say it's one of the Switch's strongest VN available. It has an approachable playtime while still providing a satisfying story with a strong and emotional conclusion. I actually enjoyed how scaled back things were, as it allowed the story to focus on what mattered the most without ever overstaying its welcome. If you want to get into key visual novels but are slightly intimidated by their length, This one is the perfect entry point.
パワプロくんポケットツ
I'm not exactly sure why VNDB has the Power Pro Kun Pocket games listed, but hey, they are on there, so I might as well include them. These are a combination between a baseball sim and Tokamemo, so not really what one would consider visual novels, but regardless, they are okay. The first one has quite a lot of charm. In some ways, it feels like playing some forgotten shonen sports manga, whereas for the second one, I don't think it's as good, but still kind of decent. So, let's go with B and C tier respectively.
レイジングループ
Raging Loop is an interesting but flawed horror mystery visual novel. The moments when the story reaches its highs are simply fantastic, but its final conclusion leaves a lot to be desired. It feels quite rushed, almost as if it tried to tie together way too many plot points in too little time. Personally, it didn't deter that much from my overall enjoyment, but it's admittedly a bit of a shame. One aspect of it that I really liked was the main protagonist. He's very blunt and pragmatic, which is not that common in this genre. So as a whole, I would still recommend this one. It's quite good. The unique premise with its rural Japan setting kind of gives off some Higurashi vibes, but the story is unique enough to stand on its own. Let's go with B tier.
ロボティクスノーツ
I feel Robotics Notes is often underappreciated, almost like the black sheep of the science adventure series. It's true that this one focuses heavily on the slice of life aspect, and for a good chunk of the story, leaves to the side the type of suspense this series is renowned for. But to its credit, that slice of life is remarkably well done, in my opinion, mostly thanks to its strong cast, which might be one of the best of this series. Well, at least the side characters, the protagonist can get quite annoying at times with his obsession with some dumb mobile game. There's, however, one bad ending related to that game that I thought was kind of hilarious. But regardless, it's really the strength of that cast that carries this game, and to me, it's a perfectly solid entry in the series. A tier.
ルートダブルビフォークライムアフターデイズ
Root Double Before Crime After Days might be the closest thing to $9.99 that we are going to get on Switch. It was directed by one of the scenario writers of the Infinity series, and it shows. There are plenty of parallels between it and something like Ever 17, with it being a complex sci-fi story where the characters must somehow survive a seemingly unavoidable death after being trapped in a techno-futuristic facility. It does get a bit too complex for its own good at times, like with the choice system being overly convoluted, and it takes quite a while for things to get really going. But if you can put up with those annoyances, this one is worth reading for any mystery fan.
ルートフィルム
Root Film is a visual novel that, when making this list, I forgot I had even read, which should probably be a sign of its quality. It's decent and all, but nothing about it was particularly remarkable. The main thing I remember was the protagonist being kind of a bellend, while the main support character was the far more likable character, mostly because she often berated that blithering idiot of a protagonist. If you want a mystery story that occasionally gives Ace Attorney vibes, it's decent, but nowhere near an essential VN. C tier.
人形の傷跡
Ningyu no Kizuato, or Scar of the Doll if you want the Western name, is a weird one. It was originally a RPG Maker game released in 1999, I believe, but it has also received like 3 or so remakes. And to be honest, I really don't know why. Maybe during all those adaptations and remakes, something went wrong, and the greatness of the original was lost along the way. But this one is just kind of a mess of ideas that occasionally tries to be scary, but fails miserably. It relies on some of the lamest jump scares I've seen, while also having plenty of head-scratching plot twists. That being said, if you want to play something that gives those so bad it's good vibes, this one might be kind of entertaining. It honestly got a couple of chuckles out of me. But as a horror visual novel, yeah, no. F tier.
シーベット
Seabed is an interesting Yuri visual novel that often goes into quite unexpected territories, but it does so at a painfully glacial pace. It's the type of VN that, if you are into its narrative style, you will probably consider it one of the greatest titles on this platform. But personally, I find the boring parts to drag on for too long. Although I would still say it's interesting enough to warrant a read.
Senren Banka.
Senren Banka is one of the few translated, straightforward, no-thrills galgu available on Switch, made by Yuzusoft, which is often considered one of the most relevant developers in this genre. That being said, I feel like if you have played one of Yuzusoft's titles, you have more or less played them all, and unfortunately for Senren Banka, by the time I got to it, I had already played Sonoba Witch, which in my opinion is a far superior game. That's not to say that Senren Banka isn't without its merits. Some of its story-focused portions are relatively well presented, and the rural setting alongside the Japanese mythology, touches here and there can be entertaining. But as a whole, I just found it to be a little bit derivative.
Silver Jiken.
Silver Case is one weird-ass VN written by Suda51, who is better known for games like Killer 7 and the No More Heroes franchise. And just like those games, the story of this one is kind of bonkers. It starts off like a relatively grounded murder mystery, but what makes it interesting is seeing how it develops into something really unique. It uses an interesting dual protagonist structure, with one perspective being directly involved with the mystery and the other one just trying to figure out the truth behind it, having a more bird's-eye view approach. Although I personally found this structure to hurt the game's pacing a little bit, I felt this later side of the story was a bit less interesting. But it is still, overall, a unique story with an engaging narrative. It's a B tier.
Since Memories. 星空の下で.
Since Memories is one of the biggest disappointments I've had with VNs, which in a way is kind of surprising since I only knew about the franchise months before this game was released. Basically, it's a reboot of sorts of the Memories Off series, and after deeply enjoying the main series, thanks to the Historia collection, I was expecting this one to deliver as well. In plenty of ways, it's clear that Mages put quite a lot of effort into it, like the presentation and the general production values, which are outstanding, but the plot left quite a bit to be desired. I found most characters to be either one-dimensional or simply annoying, and from the two that I actually liked, one was left out of a route, and the other had her route suddenly derailed, focusing instead on another character. One who already had her own route, mind you. The general mystery was also quite lacking and just plain obvious. It's probably not the worst title I've ever played or anything, but it's disappointing that this is the best they had to offer as a reboot of the series. What's odd about this installment is that they rebooted the series with the next actual main installment, Memories Off Suso, Not Always True, supposedly releasing this year. Not only that, but they also decided, out of all the Memoff games, to localize this one. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say it's terrible, but it's not the greatest introduction to the series either.
Steins Gate.
Steins Gate is the type of VN that needs no introduction considering its massive popularity. It's a well-told sci-fi mystery story with surprising plot twists and a stellar true ending. I will say, though, that as far as the science adventure series goes, I still prefer Chaos Head Noah over Steins Gate, as I feel that one had a little bit more meat to it. But there's no denying that Steins Gate is a fantastic VN no matter what. However, the only version available on Switch is the Elite version, which instead of the original artwork uses anime clips, and if I'm being honest, I think it looks pretty bad. From what I've heard, it also removes some content. I personally played the original release on PC, and if you have the option, I recommend doing the same. So for that reason, I'm ranking it a bit lower than I would otherwise.
Summer Pockets.
Summer Pockets was actually one of the first visual novels I read in Japanese back when it came out on Switch, around 2019 or so. I feel like out of all full-length key VENs, this is probably the most approachable, considering that it's quite easy to get into the routes, and unlike other VNs of theirs, I don't think there's one route that's clearly inferior to the rest. The same goes for the expansion Reflection Blue, which adds new routes that are just as good as the ones from the base game. Probably the only caveat I have with this game is that it doesn't have peaks that rival CLANNAD or Little Buster's Impact. But again, unlike those games, I don't think there were any clear low points in the story. I also have to say that out of all of their games, this one I found to have the best humor. It has a cast of characters with great chemistry between them, leading to plenty of amusing scenes. The atmosphere is also really pleasant, especially if you play it during the summer. Overall, I can strongly recommend it. Hopefully, their official release of Reflection Blue is not that far away, but if you want to play it, there's the fan patch already available, at least on PC. I'm going to put this one in the S tier.
Synergia.
Synergia feels like a VN whose priorities are in the wrong place. It's a pretty short cyberpunk story that for some reason has like 20 or more characters, and considering its runtime, this ultimately means that almost none of them get any proper character development, except the main two girls, I guess. But even then, the structure of it is just weird. At some point, the story splits into two possible outcomes, but both end up being extremely rushed, with random new characters being introduced out of nowhere. I think there could have been a good story in here had they made the game fully linear and focused on a smaller cast of characters. But as it stands, it's just not exactly what I would call a good VN.
時計仕掛けのレイライン、かげろうにさまよう魔女。
The Tokeijikake no Ley Line Trilogy was a quite enjoyable series of visual novels that combined really well fantasy, comedy, and romance. Like other VNs that also use this multiple installment approach to their narrative, the games do get better the deeper you get into the story, which also means that the first one is slightly weaker than the rest, but I still enjoyed it for what it was. And then the second one added an Ojusama character with drilled hair and an oh-ho-ho laugh, and that's really all you need to get me hooked. It's a series of games with great foreshadowing and unexpected narrative developments, with the final chapter delivering a deeply satisfying conclusion.
Tomoyo After, It's a Wonderful Life.
Tomoyo After, on the other hand, was probably the biggest disappointment I've had with any visual novel, period. Tomoyo was one of my favorite characters from CLANNAD, and I feel this spin-off did her dirty, changing her personality for no reason, and having a story with some baffling nonsensical plot points. I'm also not sure the game really knows what it wants to say. It's basically divided into two parts, but the second part has barely any relation to the first one, almost as if they were two stories from two different games, and then it ends in perhaps the worst way possible. It's one visual novel that I simply can't recommend at all, especially for fans of the original and Tomoyo, ironically enough.
Tsui no Stella.
I'm going to make a rather odd inclusion and rank Tsui no Stella too, since I'm 100% sure this game will, at some point, get a Switch port with English. It's one of the latest kinetic visual novels by Key, and honestly, it might be their strongest one so far. The world building in this futuristic narrative is, pardon the pun, stellar. The premise follows the usual Key formula, but it's brought to a whole new level thanks to the scenario writer, Tanaka Romeo, who's quite famous in this medium for cult classics like Cross Channel or Saihara no Ima, and he delivered one more time. The only reason I'm ranking it below Planetarian is because I'm quite fond of it, since it was one of my first visual novels. But I'm sure if I were to play these two VNs for the first time, I would easily say that Tsui no Stella is the superior one.
Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon.
Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon, is perhaps the visual novel with the highest production values I've seen so far, and it certainly puts them to good use. If I'm being honest, I'm not the biggest action VN fan. Generally speaking, I can appreciate some fights here and there, but games that have a big focus on them end up boring me slightly. That being said, Tsukihime managed to keep me engaged throughout, thanks to its great pacing and combination of genres. Regarding the changes made to the story in this remake, I know some of them caused a bit of controversy, but I found almost all of them to be an improvement over the original, especially with the CL side of the story and the inclusion of Noel, who, as a character, I think is a brilliant addition to the plot. CL's route does drag on a bit towards the ending, but even then, It's a clear improvement over the original. I will say, though, that it does feel like you are only playing half of the story, since some of the new characters barely have any screen time and feel somewhat out of place. Hopefully, we don't have to wait too long for the second part of this remake to come out and properly flesh out all of these new additions. Valhalla is a VN hybrid that really understands how to make a likable cast of characters while creating a clever context for the protagonist to interact with them organically. It feels like peeking through a window and getting a glimpse of their life and the world in which they live. I actually quite like how it lacks any major narrative with massive plot twists or anything, and instead takes a more laid-back approach, mostly focusing on the interactions between the characters. As a result, it ends up being a seriously chill and enjoyable time. Great for those who want to read something that's well worth it while not being too plot-intensive.
Worldend Syndrome.
I know Worldend Syndrome has quite a lot of fans, but hot take incoming, I think it's quite mediocre. This is mostly because I already played a game that did basically everything Worldend Syndrome was going for, but did it much better. That game being Summer Pockets. On the other hand, Worldend Syndrome feels quite underdeveloped in many ways, like its narrative, structure, and characters. I don't understand why it forces you to go through a couple of routes that have absolutely nothing to do with the general mystery and are also empty in terms of character development, especially with the main protagonist, who lacks anything resembling a personality. The general systems are also a bit wanky. I know some like the supposed freedom you get by choosing from an in-game map where you want to go, but it just means that you might skip completely some events that are vital to the plot, which consequently means you will get a guaranteed bad ending for that route. Plus, it's beyond me how a developer can release a visual novel nowadays without a save-at-any-time feature. I know most of its praise comes from the true ending, but even that revelation I found to be cheap, and that it created plot holes in an already iffy narrative. I will say, though, that the backgrounds are nice, but that's kind of it.
この世の果てで恋を歌う少女
You Know is a really old-school VN, both in its storytelling and general systems, which might actually be a turn-off for some, but personally I'm all into it. In many aspects, it was a revolutionary title for its time, and I think it holds up remarkably well, especially the main twist. There's probably a couple of things to keep in mind, however. One being that, despite the newly added quality of life improvements, it's still quite easy to get lost and end up completely stuck in a bad ending, so it's advised to use a guide. And also, the translation itself isn't that great. I remember playing it back when my Japanese wasn't exactly there, and even then, I could spot quite a few mistranslations. But regardless, I can still recommend it overall.
冤罪執行遊戯ゆるキル
Eurokill is a weird mix of genres that doesn't really pay off. It more or less tries to be like a Danganronpa type of story, and mixes it up with some escape-the-room puzzles and, oddly enough, shmup portions. But in the end, neither part of the game is particularly fleshed out, and you end up getting a fairly underwhelming experience. Also, the ending makes no sense. I think they wanted to add a big twist to end on a high note, but in my opinion, it backfires quite spectacularly. The only parts that I thought were somewhat enjoyable were the puzzles, but I think the story is too weak to really push the player towards the end. A D-tier visual novel, if you can even call it one. And that's going to be all of it. As someone with more than 200 finished VNs, I can easily say that the Switch has garnered a fairly robust catalog, especially if you can read Japanese, or if you are into anime visual novels, I guess. But nevertheless, it's worth keeping in mind that visual novels are usually one of those genres that, even after the next generation of consoles arrives, keeps getting new releases. I'm personally quite looking forward to the next Memories Off games, but there's also one or two VNs out there that have caught my attention. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it helpful, entertaining, or good enough for background noise. All right, have a good one. Marine out.